Okay, so first of all, thank you to the organizers, particularly Daniel, as we are told, who's done the most for this session. And I'm really pleased to be here, really pleased to hear everyone who's spoken so far. Looking forward to Brett Christopher's presentation later on, and of course, Michael's. So as Daniel pointed out, I've entitled my talk, What's in a Name? The Misuses of Feudalism and Capitalism. And in brief, I'm going to argue that by calling the contemporary economic system in which we are living neo-feudalism, we are demonstrating our misunderstanding of both feudalism and capitalism. But let me first start out by saying that there is no doubt that the literature on so-called neo-feudalism, or at least the best of it, is concerned about a real problem. So, for instance, to quote just one of the relatively good pieces on the subject, Stone and Kuttner make some excellent points. They say, and I'm now quoting, it's slightly longish quote, so I'll tell you when it ends. The system of finance, they say, once supervised by bank regulatory agencies and Securities and Exchange Commission, has been delegated to private realms of law. The financial collapse of 2008 is best understood as the seizure, corruption, and abuse of entire domains of regulation and jurisprudence. Laws to protect workers and consumers, reflecting 70 years of struggle to expand rights, are now erased by compulsory arbitration regimes. Trade law permits similar private tribunals to overturn or sidestep public regulation. Tech platform monopolies have created a proprietary regime where they can crush competitors and invade consumer privacy by means of onerous terms, often buried in online terms of service provisions. The unity of common scientific inquiry has been balkanized by confidentiality agreements and abuses of patents as scientific knowledge becomes owned by private entities. Companies like Monsanto manipulating intellectual property and trade law prevent farmers from following the ancient practice of keeping seeds for the next planting season. This, they say, is not deregulation or neoliberalism. It is legally sanctioned private jurisprudence, neo-feudalism, unquote. So what Stone and Kuttner says is that not only is this not capitalism, it's not even neoliberalism. And of course, I'm going to argue that it is neoliberalism. It has always been about expanding private power. That is, neoliberalism has always been about expanding private power. It has never been about markets or competition. And I'll elaborate on that as I go along. So like most conceptions of neo-feudalism, Stone and Kuttner idealize not only capitalism itself, but in their case, implicitly, and which they idealize implicitly, if not explicitly, in its competitive form, as though that is the only type of capitalism. There is no other type of capitalism. And Stone and Kuttner also wrongly assume that, they're idealizing neoliberalism because they think that it's about markets and competition. And that's why the reality of what is happening now must, according to them, be separated even from neoliberalism. And then, of course, they idealize what Stone and Kuttner call democracy, which they equate with the golden age of capitalism, when I think we will all agree that capitalism was on its best behavior that it has been so far. So that's the way I see the situation. Now, there are many things wrong with this. The first and most important is that competition always culminates in monopoly. Or put it another way, monopoly is the result of the process of competition, which eliminates rivals, leaves a handful or one entity standing out of the competition. This is the destiny of capitalism as classically analyzed by Marx. Moreover, Marx goes further because he has something to say about what happens at this point. In chapter 27 of volume 3 of Capital, Marx had outlined how the ever greater concentration of capital in large monopoly firms, facilitated by the emergence of joint stock companies, constituted a huge advance in the socialization of production. This was, for Marx, the most important function of capitalism historically. The only reason why he considered it at all progressive was that it socialized production. It may do it brutally, it may do it anarchically, but it does it. And that's what's progressive about it. And it will have, under monopoly capitalism, brought that process of socialization to a peak. In this type, a new type of firm, Marx says, what was once individual capital, quote, now receives the form of social capital, capital of directly associated individuals in contrast to private capital. And its enterprises appear as social enterprises as opposed to private ones. This is the abolition of capital and private property within the confines of the capitalist mode of production itself, unquote. That was Marx. The transition to monopoly, aided by state intervention and credit, is, Marx continues, a self-abolishing contradiction, which presents itself prima facie as a point of transition to a new form of production, unquote, namely socialism. As production is thus amalgamated and massified, its profoundly social character is on full display. The owner-operator of early capitalism is split functionally into two: the manager paid for his or her labor of oversight of a complex organization, and the mere money capitalist who no longer makes profit but only interest. A mere reward for capital ownership, which is now completely separated from the actual production process, unquote. The result is a historical rather than merely conceptual clarification, according to Marx. The profit is reduced. Let me say that again. The result is a historical rather than merely conceptual clarification. That is to say, in the process of the arrival of monopoly capitalism, something gets objectively clarified, not just conceptually. Profit, according to Marx, is reduced to interest, is exposed as, quote, simply the appropriation of other people's surplus labor arising from the transformation of the means of production into capital, that is, from their estrangement vis-a-vis the actual producer, from their opposition as the property of another vis-a-vis all individuals really active in production, from the manager down to the lowest day laborer, and unquote. That's okay. Such capitalist production in its highest development. So Marx considers monopoly capital to be capitalist production in its highest development. Such production is, Marx continued, and this is the key, the necessary, I'm quoting him again, quote, necessary point of transition towards the transformation of capital back into the property of the producers, though no longer as the private property of individual producers, but rather as their property as associated producers, as directly social property. It is furthermore a point of transition towards the transformation of all functions formerly bound up with capital ownership in the reproduction process into simple functions of associated producers, into social functions, unquote. Engels observes editorially at this point, because he edited volume 3, that tendencies toward cartelization and toward concentrating, quote, the entire production of the branch of industry in question into one big joint stock company with a unified management, unquote, prepares, quote, in the most pleasing fashion, its future appropriation by society as a whole, by the nation, unquote. And this development, according to Engels, was likely to be aided by the fact that this transformation also gives rise to monopoly in certain spheres and hence provokes state intervention. So essentially what Marx and Engels envisage is that once capitalism arrives at its monopoly phase, it will be ripe for transition to socialism. This will be apparent to everybody because productive forces have been massively centralized, they are monopolized, and the illegitimacy of the private ownership of monopoly will become apparent to all. This is at least his anticipation, their anticipation. Marx then goes on to refer in particular to the role of the financial system at this stage. What is the financial system going to do in this process? However, before we can understand what he meant by that, we must understand how he conceived the evolution of finance under capitalism, a point originally made by Marx and later elaborated by Hilferding in Finance Capital. So let me unpack this a little bit. Though financial capital is older than industrial capital, because financial capital existed before the onset of productive capitalism, Marx anticipated that capitalism's maturation would lead to the, quote, subordination of interest-bearing capital to the conditions and requirements of modern industry, unquote. principally through, quote, the transformed figure of the borrower, unquote. The borrower would no longer be a supplicant. I've got 20 minutes left. Yeah. No longer be a supplicant in financial straits, but a capitalist to whom money is lent, quote, in the expectation that he will use it to appropriate unpaid labor, unquote. Whereas the initial stages of this process of subordination had led to calls of using, quote, violence, that is the state, against interest-bearing capital to effect a compulsory reduction of interest rates. So the bourgeoisie is militating against financial capital in a certain way. Mature industrial capital, Marx opined, would achieve this transformation much more thoroughly and effectively through, quote, the creation of a procedure specific to itself, the credit system, which, and I'm quoting him now, which is its own creation, as is itself a form of industrial capital, which begins with manufacture and develops further with large-scale industry, unquote. When it first emerged, the credit system took a polemical form directed against old-fashioned usurers. Now, in line with this understanding, Hilferding says the following. Hilferding says, at the outset of capitalist production, money capital in the form of usurers and merchants' capital plays a significant role in the accumulation of capital as well as in the transformation of handicraft production into capitalism. But there then arises a resistance of productive capital, that is of the profit-earning capitalists, that is of commerce and industry, against interest-earning capitalists. Usurers' capital becomes subordinated to industrial capital. As money-dealing capital, it performs the functions of money which industry and commerce would otherwise have had to carry out themselves in the process of transformation of their commodities. As bank capital, it arranges credit operations among productive capitalists. So Marx is saying essentially that capitalism would take the inherited system of finance and transform it into something that would aid the expansion of productive capitalism. Since I have less time, I'm just going to jump to this. Okay, so Hilferding, as you very well know, or you should know if you don't, in finance capital contrasts two very different forms of financial systems. On the one hand, there is the long-term finance provided for long-term productive investment, of which the German financial system is paradigmatic. And on the other hand is the British financial system, which provides only short-term commercial credit, has never been involved in long-term commercial investment, and is associated with speculation and short-termism. Sorry, I'm just jumping a little bit here, so give me a second. Right. And so the paradigmatic finance capital, although it involves the domination of finance capital, this domination is exercised in the interest of expanding productive capitalist investment. So in Hilferding, these two forms of investments are not just contrasted historically, that is, there is the old usurers form and now there is the new capitalist form, but also geographically, in that he contrasts German bank industry relations, as I've already said, with the British system. And I would like to emphasize one thing. To anticipate some points I will be making at the conclusion, let me also say that precisely the polar opposite characteristics of the British system to the German system is what enabled the British system to be the operator of the gold sterling standard. The German system then would not have been capable of doing this, as will not the Chinese system today. For all the talk about whether the renminbi will ever replace the dollar, I have been arguing in numerous writings and speeches and so on, that it cannot and should not, unless China wishes to see the type of deindustrialization experienced by the UK and the US. Having made these points, we are now ready to return to how Marx sees the role of credit and finance in the transformation of capitalism into socialism, a point which Hilferding also develops further. The credit system, which is everywhere a creature of state regulation for Marx, greatly aids these processes because, quote, It reproduces a new financial aristocracy, a new kind of parasite in the guise of company promoters, speculators, and merely nominal directors. An entire system of swindling and cheating with respect to the promotion of companies, issue of shares and share dealings. It is private production unchecked by private ownership. And further, he says, I'll skip that a little bit. And then he says the credit system not only accelerates capitalist development, the credit system of this evolved capitalist sort, of the German sort, it also accelerates crisis and the dissolution of capitalism itself. In doing so, it moves capitalism closer to socialism. And here I'm quoting Marx again. The credit system has a dual character immanent in it. On the one hand, it develops the motive of capitalist production, enrichment by the exploitation of others' labor, into its purest and most colossal system of gambling and swindling, and restricts ever more the already small number of exploiters of social wealth. On the other hand, however, it constitutes the form of transition towards a new mode of production. It is this dual character that gives the principal spokesman for credit from John Law through Isaac Pereire, their nicely mixed character of swindler and prophet. And as some of you may know, Hilferding is often ridiculed for having said that if you nationalize 6 large Berlin banks, then you will have taken many steps closer to socialism. People laugh at him because they think that the Berlin banks are like the banks today. No, he was talking about 6 large Berlin banks, not 6 large London banks. 6 large London banks, they would have been meaningless. 6 large Berlin banks controlled a very substantial part of German production. This is the key. Okay, so thus here Marx argued that when it arrived at its monopoly phase, when most if not all sectors of economic activity became dominated by monopoly, capitalism would become ripe for socialism. It would have performed its historic function of socializing the forces of production in the highest form. It would be obvious that private monopolies are illegitimate, and it would lose its productive dynamism, something that would take away even the minimal legitimacy it had. Now, capitalism had already reached its monopoly phase in the early 20th century. Lenin was not wrong to say it was the highest phase. Interestingly, neoclassical economics, which took its purest form in the dogmatically pro-capitalist Austrian version, emerged at the same time. And one of its dirtiest intellectual secrets is its conceit that capitalism has remained competitive. Its historical function has been to legitimize monopoly capital through the ideology of free markets and competition. That is why the neoliberal era has witnessed the advance of the power of giant corporations under the covering fire of the rhetoric about markets and competition. This is what Stone and Kuttner do not understand when they say that the current dispensation is not even neoliberal. In reality, Lenin was not being merely rhetorical or just attacking Kautsky when he insisted that capitalism had arrived at its highest phase. Even Keynes and Polanyi anticipated in the interwar period that a certain tipping point had been reached and that the path for humanity at the end of the crisis period after the Second World War lay in humanity leaving capitalism behind and taking another path forward. They didn't necessarily call it socialism, etc., but that's what they imagined it would be, some form of moving beyond capitalism. Hayek feared the same outcome, which he sought to forestall by writing The Road to Serfdom and setting up the more Pellerin Society. In a sense, Marx, Keynes, and Polanyi were not wrong. The world did turn left after the Second World War with the Keynesian welfare state in first world countries, communist regimes from Prague to Pyongyang, as I like to say, and national autonomous development projects in the developing world. Most have misread what happened after the Second World War. They thought that the anticipation of the end of capitalism was wide of the mark and that capitalism had demonstrated its remarkable ability to bounce back. Hence the popularity of Schumpeter, who think that capitalism is like that child's toy. You knock it down and it comes back up again. And that's what it does all the time. But the dynamism of the golden age was not due to capitalism, but due to the socialistic modifications it had undergone. Just to quote Hobsbawm from The Age of Extremes, he characterized this period in the following way. He said, a return to laissez-faire and the unreconstructed free market were out of the question. Certain policy objectives, such as full employment, containment of communism, modernization of lagging or declining or ruined economies, had absolute priority and justified the strongest government presence. Even regimes dedicated to economic and political liberalism now could and had to run their economies in ways that would once have been rejected as socialist. So, yes. These modifications, not capitalism, accounted for the productive dynamism of the post-war era, principally by expanding domestic demand as decolonization and communism closed off other markets. This fact ought to have been clear to people at that time, certainly to Marxists at that time, but it was not. However, after 4 decades of neoliberalism, that is to say, giving ever greater freedoms to capital, and after watching what the results of these 4 decades has been, which has resulted in ever lower rather than ever higher growth, ever lower rather than ever higher investment, we finally can record what a senile monopoly capitalism is like. It is incapable of growth or of investment, and it has turned to financialization and the creation and maintenance of monopoly power domestically and internationally through all means possible. I'm now no longer talking about competition, but the use of state power to maintain monopoly both domestically and internationally. So by calling today's capitalism feudal, we are excusing capitalism. We are forgetting that capitalism itself is historical and that its contradictions are the chaotic motor that drives its history forward, and that those contradictions have brought it to where we are today. That therefore it must not be reduced to an idealized competitive form. That today's economic system is what capitalism looks like when it has run its course and is still being kept alive by the inability of productive forces to take us beyond it towards socialism. And in this present context, it is bound to get even uglier than it is today. Now, let me just say a couple of things about rent. These remarks are more in the form of a research agenda than a finished thesis. I'm not a historian. I'm certainly not a great historian of feudalism, as one of our previous speakers was. So please forgive me, but this is what I would like to say, propose to you. First of all, you have to understand that rent is not characteristic of feudalism. What is the characteristic form of surplus extraction in feudalism? It is not rent. It is feudal dues, tithes, compulsory services, whether they are offered in kind, in labor, or in money, it does not matter, but that is what characterizes feudalism. I should also add that in feudalism, land is not alienable. You cannot buy and sell land. And it is based on, no matter how minimal they are and no matter the misery of the serf, it is based on certain reciprocal obligations of lord and serf, which are completely non-existent in capitalism. Capital does not give a mosquito's ass about what happens to the worker. Okay, so let us remember that. Okay, so as far as I can tell, feudalism's typical form of surplus extraction, as I say, was through various forms of feudal dues. Rent began to intrude upon this scenario. And by the way, I have consulted Marx, particularly the chapters on rent at the very end of volume 3, and I have consulted what I can of Bloch's work on feudalism. Beyond that, I don't know. But let me just say this. From what I can tell from these two sources, rent emerges in the course of struggles between serfs and landlords, in which rent becomes a substitute for the landlord. If the landlord is forced to recognize to some extent certain greater equality of the serf, then he commutes the dues, but he substitutes it with rent. And this is how rent appears, because rent is between two equal contracting parties, not between a social superior and a social inferior. So that's the first thing. So to me, that's what rent appears to be. The transformation of feudal dues into rent represented, on the one hand, the greater social equality of the producer, but nevertheless involved extracting surplus product. Marx is very clear that rent is a capitalist category. And like interest, it is a deduction from profit, wages, and government revenues, all of which are emerge from productive activity of one sort or another. Rentier capitalism, therefore, is what you get when you give capital the freedom that you give it we have given it under neoliberalism, when we keep capitalism alive past its sell-by date. And we have kept capitalism alive by giving capital more and more freedom to do what it likes. And this is what it does when you leave it to itself. Now, I would, how much time do I have? Okay, that's good. I did time it. Okay. So I just want to add a final set of points. I said earlier about how the short-termist character of the British financial system between roughly 1870 and 1914 was what enabled it to operate the sterling system. Now, I have also written a lot about the dollar system in vis-a-vis the sterling system and how the two are contrasted and how the dollar system has always been unviable. So let me just say a couple of things about that. So, because it's related to this. We live in an age when the idea that the currency of the dominant country is the currency of the world or should be the currency of the world has become naturalized. But the sterling system, so when we say dollar is the world's money today, just as sterling was the world's money in the past. But the sterling was not a national currency. It was an imperial currency. It was able to supply liquidity to the rest of the world, essentially through capital exports, not because it was so wondrously productive of capital that it could afford to export it, but precisely because it extracted surpluses from its non-settler colonies. And I'm talking about British India, later Africa, the Caribbean, etc. But British India was always the biggest chunk of this. Extracted surpluses from these non-settler colonies and exported them as capital exports to Europe, to the United States, and to the remaining British settler colonies. This is why the gold sterling standard period is the period of the most rapid industrialization of these countries. And that is how it exported capital. Even with these surpluses, the system required a short-term financial system because basically, as Keynes's Indian Currency and Finance describes very well, and by the way, you should all think about why a little book called Indian Currency and Finance is still regarded as the primer on how the gold standard worked, is because British India, not just present-day India, but British India was so central to its functioning. It could not have worked without it. So anyway, as Keynes pointed out, Britain operated the gold standard with hardly any gold. He even jokes that even the Caja of Argentina has more gold, you know about that, had more gold than the Bank of England. And why was it able to do so? Because the moment it needed to, it could increase interest rates and decrease them at will, because also it did not care about the effects of this on economic activity and employment within Britain, because the British working class was not yet sufficiently organized to assert its own interests. We no longer live in that world. So even then, the sort of financial systems that created strong productive systems in Germany, in Japan, in early 20th century United States, they could not have played a similar role because their money was tied up in long-term investments. And the British system, the British gold sterling standard, it is not a surprise that the period of the gold sterling standard, roughly 1870 to 1914, is also the period of the beginning of the long-term productive and industrial decline of the UK, which continues to this day. Unable to export capital, the US has never been able to create a stable system of dollar dominance. Before 1971, it was essentially already, it had a rocky decade before the gold link to gold had to be broken. Robert Triffin explained why this was the case. And after 1971, the dollar system has only worked because the US financial system, which back in the day Hilferding considered to be close to the German one, capable of long-term productive investment, has been systematically transformed into something resembling the British system more. So we're talking about two very different models of finance. The one which is short-term leads to deindustrialization in Britain in the past and in the US today. There is nothing admirable about it. Okay. And then there is another system of finance which Marx anticipated might exist in mature capitalism and would be the bridge to socialism. It still exists in parts. I would say in substantial way it exists in China today, but that's another whole system of discussion altogether. So I will end here for now. Thank you very much. First of all, I just wanted to say that I was very pleased to hear Brett's talk because contrary to my impressions earlier, because I have read some of your work, there's a lot more agreement between us than I thought. I mean, I thought there was substantial agreement, but I thought there were also important differences, but now I can't remember them. But let me just say that to answer both of your questions. So my comment that I would like to make about Brett's talk, I'll go first, and then I'll come back to the question of rentier versus monopoly capitalism. So I actually, in my book, Capitalism, Coronavirus and War, I've elaborated this argument, but I've been making it for decades now. Well, certainly for a decade, maybe more than one decade. Neoliberalism is fundamentally wrong in the sense that it is a wrong description of reality. Okay, it does not describe the economic reality that the economy does best when you have free markets, etc., etc. Nor is it correct that competitive capitalism still exists. So in that sense, it was never going to correspond to any, applying it was never going to work. And because applying it was never going to work, it had to constantly shift shape. And that's what we've seen it do about once a decade over the last 40 plus years. So first you got classic neoliberalism of the Reagan and Thatcher type, and I would say that it was a kind of, shall we say, I hate to be complimentary to them, but I think let's just say that, imagine that they genuinely believed that opening up, deregulating, privatizing, all these things, making taxation regressive, etc., would actually help revive the economy. But by the end of that decade, it was quite clear that it was not working. And even the IMF and the World Bank were beginning to say that, the state has to play a role, etc. In the 1990s, you got allegedly left-of-center governments taking power, the Blairs and the Clintons and so on, and they produced a new discourse. They essentially said to their mainly working-class constituents, we would love to give you higher wages, more benefits, expand the welfare state, increase your rights, increase regulation, etc. But you know what? Our hands are tied. Our hands are tied because of globalization. So that was the globalization decade of the 1990s. In the 2000s, you got the US hegemony, US rules, etc. decade. Ironically, just when the US economy was performing the worst ever and only limping along because of the massive asset inflation that they had created. In the 2010s, you got austerity. And now, after COVID, etc., we have what I call pseudo-civic capitalism. And that corresponds to what Brett was saying earlier, which is that the whole thing is essentially about giving capital lucrative contracts to supply what we all allegedly need, whether it is medicines or infrastructure or green energy or whatever. So you essentially give corporations massive subsidies, sweet contracts, PPP deals or PFI deals, whatever you call them, etc. And that's going to be the shape of the future. And that was where I was going initially. And then I realized that there's actually a darker possibility that in the process of giving this, you might actually end up having forces come to power like the Trumps and the Johnsons of this world, who actually represent something even worse, a more authoritarian form of capitalism. But the one thing that will not have changed throughout all of these decades, that it's all about giving big monopoly capital more and more freedom, which does not achieve any significant economic improvement, but it allows this type of capitalism to thrive. So that's the way I look at it. That is, you have had different versions, but the essence is the same. And the essence is not markets, it's not competition, it's the power of big monopoly corporations. Now we come to rentier capitalism. So, I was listening with interest when Brett said that he's not sure that financialization has created low growth. I agree with him. I think it's a kind of chicken and egg thing. The crisis of the 1970s already was a crisis in which, for whatever reason, whether it's falling profits or saturated demand or whatever it may be, capitalists have not been investing. If they're not investing and when I say investing, not investing productively. If you're not investing productively, what do? You're not going to sow your dollars in a mattress. No, you're going to put it in banks to earn financial interest and so on. And the capitalist world is awash with this kind of money. Mark Carney, when he was still governor of the Bank of Canada, was already complaining that big corporations were sitting on absolutely piles of cash that they were not investing productively. This still remains true. Markets are going up while the economy is tanking. Why? Because there's so much money sloshing about in the system. It's got to go somewhere. So we have apparently got an everything bubble right now. It's not just a housing bubble or a commodities bubble. It's an everything bubble. Every possible type of asset is inflated in value because people have got to put their money somewhere. Rich people, obviously, not you and me. So in that sense, then, to come back to the point, I would say that so what I've argued is that what I call neoliberal financialized capitalism is the only kind of capitalism you can have today. It's a bit like Ford. He said you can have any color of car you like so long as the color you like is black. You can have any kind of capitalism you like so long as the one you like is neoliberal financialized capitalism. Now you call it rentier, but no other form of capitalism is possible. That's why I made the link to Marx, monopoly, Marx, socialism, etc. I think that we have been keeping capitalism alive well past, decades past its sell-by date. Okay, and we have, and in the golden age period, what we saw was not the miracle of capitalism; it was the miracle of the socialistic reforms we had made to capitalism, which put capitalism on better behavior. This is also corroborated by many of the things that have been said by various people, which is that we had a more progressive taxation, we had better regulation, because capitalism was on its back foot. It had just caused the biggest crisis in the world, including 2 world wars, a Great Depression. It was not, very popular. And that's why these reforms were necessary and possible. So we had that, and 4 decades of neoliberalism have shown us that if you do what capital wants, which is give it more freedom, and we do it because capitalism is in power, capital is in power, we're giving it what it wants, this is what you get. You're not going to get anything different. And we are not, the moment we return to a more industrially dynamic capitalism, or the only way of returning to a more industrially dynamic capitalism, is to impose greater regulation on capital in a way that takes away its freedom. That is already going to be a pretty revolutionary move. And let me say one more thing. I entirely agree. I've made the same argument about industrial policy in my book. That is, the Inflation Reduction Act is not going to lead to any viable industrial policy. But consider this. Every successful example of industrial policy, whether it is in late 19th century Germany or South Korea in the 20th century, or Taiwan, etc., Japan for that matter, have all been instances in which, for one reason or another, one historical reason or another, the capitalist class does not have complete freedom. It had somebody else's will imposed upon it, whether it was a foreign power or your own Junker landlord class, or whatever it may be. It was not completely in power. The moment you and in the case of China, because you have essentially a socialist government in power, it will limit the prerogatives of capitalism. So I think that we can move towards a system where we will have capital. We may even have big capital, but it cannot have political power. That's the key. So those were my answers.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, both of you, for the talks, which I thought were fantastic. I had a question about rent for each of you. First to Radhika, your definition of rent, from what I understood, excludes the feudal obligations. I was just wondering if you could elaborate on what is the yield of this definition, because we talked about narrow definitions of capitalism. Morozov says that all this talk about neo-feudalism is because some people have narrow definitions of capitalism. Brad talked about narrow definitions of neoliberalism. And I was wondering if that definition of rent is not too narrow. So that would be my question for you.
Okay, so I wanted to answer your question, Eduardo, and also want to come back to the point that you raised. So my answer to your question about rent, you said that it's not, yeah. So am I not making too narrow a definition? Well, it seems to me that, as I say, if you say that profit is the characteristic form of surplus extraction in capitalism, then the corresponding term in feudalism would not be rent. It would be feudal dues. And as I say, the way I think rent has emerged is as a result of the class struggle between landlord and serf, so to speak. But secondly, I would also say that rent is a specifically capitalist category. I think I'm not wrong, but rent involves alienable land. Because what is the value of land? This is the capitalized value of the rent you will receive on it, right? So in that sense, and secondly, rent and interest are deductions from productive incomes, which are profits and wages. And as I say, secondarily, government revenues. And that's what we see happening. So in that sense, I don't believe it's too narrow a definition. And then I just wanted to say that, about what has happened in the last couple of years, you talked about inflation and fiscal stimulus and the rise in interest rates. I just want to say that the return of inflation in one level is part of a larger, you had big inflation in the 1970s. That was a crisis of imperialism as well as capitalism, and we have another today. And that comes arise because we did not have low inflation in between, because Alan Greenspan and Ben Bernanke were such maestros in orchestrating the economy. It had nothing to do with that. It had everything to do with the fact that both working people and the third world they had their incomes deflated essentially. And therefore, they were not able to demand prices. And that situation is now changing. And I don't think inflation is going anywhere. That's one thing I want to say. The second thing I want to say is that if you plot, and you can do this on the Federal Reserve website, if you can plot inflation, the graph of inflation, with the graph of the federal effective interest, whatever it's called, interest rate, the effective federal funds rate. If you plot those two together, what you will see is that even now with 5% plus interest rates, the Federal Reserve is much more tolerant of inflation than it was back in the Volcker's day. Volcker essentially said, I'm going to constrict money supply, and I don't care where interest rates go. And they ended up in double digits, nearly 18, 20%, whatever they became for a brief time. But that's how and then he induced a recession. Powell cannot do that. Not because he cares about the economy. He doesn't care. In fact, he wants to create a recession which will reduce wages, which will discipline workers, etc. But he dare not do that. Why? Because increasing increasing interest rates much beyond the point they have already reached will prick the everything bubble. And once it pricks the everything bubble, the wealth of all those to whom he really owes his allegiance, not you and me, the wealth of his friends will decline massively. Paul Volcker didn't have to worry about that. But these guys have created that asset bubble upon which the wealth rises. And remember, last time, this has happened once before. In the run-up to 2008, the Federal Reserve was forced to increase interest rates. And if you look at the chart of interest rates, you will see the same pattern, quarter percent, whatever, little by little, they increased it. It only had to go to 5.25% before it pricked the housing and credit bubbles. Today, we are already there. They dare not go much higher. They are tolerating a lot of inflation. And that will, of course, so either the dollar will lose its value because there will be a big financial crisis. And if you avoid that, then fine, it is losing its value anyway because of it.
I just wanted to follow up on something Radhika said and ask you to maybe hum a few more bars about what you meant about taking away capitalism's political power. Because on the one hand, you say emphatically that there are ways in which capitalism has passed its expiration date. But on the other hand, from what I understood, rightly or wrongly, from your presentation, was this emphasis on monopoly capitalism and presumably the problematic overcoming of competition and the decline of productive investment. But one might think if the problem is monopoly capitalism, then one could redo the New Deal. One could redo, make American capitalism great again through emphatic state intervention, regulation, antitrust, perhaps above all. In which case, it wouldn't be the overcoming of capitalism, but the rejuvenation of a mixed economy or an embedded capitalism. So when you say taking away capital's political power, I was just hoping you could clarify exactly what you meant with respect to that confusion I had from your talk. Maybe we'll take one more. Daniel, go ahead. Yeah. Thanks.
Okay, so I have a couple questions, and I guess feel free to discard them if they're off on the wrong path. But one is about a common feature I perceived in both of your accounts. So, Radhika, you were talking about Hilferding on German and Anglo models of capitalism, and he wasn't the only one to talk about this. Many people talk about this. Sorry, can you hear me now? Okay. Yeah, he wasn't the only one to talk about the competition between German and Anglo models of capitalism. And historically, obviously, the Anglo model won. That's the story there. So to contrast being finance, investing on production, dominating industry, but also eventually merging with industry in a productive way, making those gains through production. The Anglo one being, lend speculatively and make asset gains unproductively. Okay. So, Brett, you also said the UK, is the quintessential form of rentier capitalism, and expect stagnation in an economy where rentiers dominate. So, my question is, if this is just capitalism, then why does it look like to me what happened historically, politically, is that a certain form of capitalism won a political struggle? That's how it seems to me. And I wonder what you think about that. And if it's on the wrong path, feel free to discard it. The other one is about the idea that just deductions from surplus value, which is, basically aggregate profit formed through growth in Marx's formulation. Now, I don't mean this to criticize Marx. I'm not an anti-Marxist. On the contrary. But one thing maybe he couldn't have pictured is the idea that, you'd have immense automation and then stagnation. And then, you'd have something where you're not getting those gains, redistribution gains, rent and interest through, deductions of surplus value. But actually, it's just a kind of way of capturing extant wealth. And then, then we might not be able to say rent and interest are just portions of surplus value. If it's not, if there isn't growth, then it could be, a shrinking pie, getting a bigger piece of a shrinking pie. So I just wonder, can we be so sure that, rent and interest are just portions of surplus value? So those are my questions.
Some big questions. Well, maybe grab that.
Okay. So I'll take your question first. So taking away the power of capital. I think that if I had to describe, if I had to define capitalism, it would not necessarily be vis-a-vis markets or competition. It would have to be that you have a class of capitalists which have political power. So the state does what they want to do. So one way of describing it is, why do I not call China capitalist? Because yes, there are lots of capitalists in China. Yes, they are very big. Some of them are very big, very powerful, etc. But unlike in the West, they don't hold the reins of state power. The party state does, and it regulates them. So that's the way I understand it. So what do I mean by taking away the power of capital? It would be to get at least to roughly where China is, that we tell capitalists what they do, what they do. We call them on the carpet when they do things that we don't want them to do, etc. So that would be, and when I say we, I mean ideally a democratic state, but there have also been forms of forms of state which have imposed its will on capital, which have not been progressive. So South Korean state, for example, etc. The New Deal did not actually dethrone the power of capital. That was its problem. So that's why, although it was responsible for many policies, it actually did not pull the United States out of recession. It was out of the Great Depression. It was the war. Within about 4 years, Roosevelt had lost his nerve. Enough capitalists put enough pressure on him to say, don't continue. He did not continue. The economy tanked again and only picked up again after during the war. And the war was an exceptional situation in which capital was, had to do the bidding of the state for a short period of time. Although at the end of the war, capitalism regained its power. So the war was the exceptional situation, not the New Deal. So I think that's what we would have to go about. And the question of German and Anglo model, you are so right. So on the one hand, yes, the Anglo model won, but it won, but its victory can never be stable. So it is always going to be volatile, crisis prone. So just the other day, I was giving another lecture and I just pulled this graph off Wikipedia and showed it. So you see the number of financial crises that are very high in the pre-war period. Then for about 3 decades after the Second World War, they are next to no financial crisis. And then with the onset of neoliberalism, they are even greater sort of thing. So it is intensely volatile. It is crisis prone. It is also for the United States began to revert to an Anglo model much more from the 1970s onwards, which has also coincided with the deindustrialization of the United States, etc. So going back to the high point of capitalism, I think that if it had not been for the fact that the European powers had destroyed one another by fighting one another and thereby given the United States its unique moment of international power, we would have had a different situation of regional capitalisms, each competing with one another and either, having more wars or eventually, because they remain regional, particularly, or, that would have helped matters, converted into some form of socialism. I think that's what might have happened. But I agree with you. And Michael and I wrote a paper called Beyond the Dollar Creditocracy, in which we do talk about this odd, turn of events. And then rent and interest. Are there deductions from surplus value? And you mentioned automation in this regard. I mean, if you have higher automation, actually surplus value goes up. Just because you don't employ a lot of people doesn't necessarily mean you're not making a lot of surplus value. Okay, so and rent and interest being deductions from profit, essentially, or wages or other incomes derived from productive labor, is just the definition, I think. I mean, there is no, to me, that's what they are. And by the way, this definition is true in the sense that if you continue to run down the economy, the productive economy, eventually there will be no income for you to skim off as financial capital. The artificially created money, whatever you want to call it, the Federal Reserve creating under quantitative easing trillions of dollars worth of new money, only served to fill the black holes that were the bank's balance sheets. It did not actually enter the real economy. Had it done so, we would have had inflation much earlier. So I just want to say that, so I think that, the fact that there is less and less productive activity does have implications. That was part of the reason why I was asking one of the earlier speakers, I can't see him right now, but, at what stage did financial capital start buying up productive, asset managers start buying up productive assets directly? Because in the past, they were free to just buy titles to the incomes from that productive capital. But now they are down to owning those things because that is the only thing that actually makes an income. So
We have another online question, Zoom, from Ann Davis. So we're entering a world with increasing military expenditure. What would the implications be for the future of capitalism? Increasing public debt may lead to financial instability or support for the military-industrial complex? That's the question.
I want to add a question too, but maybe before I say that, I think our agenda said we were going to push on until 7 o'clock, but it's been a great day, but it's been a long day. I look out, I see some tired faces. So I think I'll add a question to that, and then maybe we'll hear from both of the speakers, and then we can stop and obviously continue to discuss these issues after we formally end the day. I guess the question I have, stepping back, and I basically think this was Keynes's position, which is that rentier capitalism is essentially what we should expect to see. If you're a capitalist, and I'm not, although I guess maybe I am because my retirement is with TIAA-CREF. So, but if you're a capitalist and you have the option to put your feet on the desk and clip a coupon and earn a profit, or you have to go out, find wage labor, buy raw materials, figure out a technology and a productive process, combine fixed capital and labor, try to figure out what ultimate demand is in a marketplace, and try to produce a commodity above the cost of production after its final sale. Who wouldn't take option one, right? It just seems kind of crazy. And so when you put it that way, it seems that the Industrial Revolution and the era of modern industry is this really strange contingent moment in the history of capitalism that one has to kind of struggle to explain for contingent reasons. And then once it's over, you kind of go back to the norm, which is wealth owners, property owners, using their power to create the scarcity of assets, extracting rents and income from everybody else. I see one shake of the head because it's a very different kind of conception than one possible kind of Marxist understanding of modern industry as representing a kind of telos of capitalism that then enters in crisis, and that crisis gets displaced, it gets managed, the can gets kicked down the road by financialization, by fictitious capital, by all these kind of different ways of in which rentier capitalism works, And anyway, it seems to me one can make both of those narratives work. And they're both probably true, and they're probably not mutually exclusive. But I'd be very curious to hear both of our speakers kind of think through them and the implications of one or the other or both. And then we have the question from Ann Davis about military expenditure too. So if you could please take that up.
Well, I guess I'll take your question first, because it goes back to what Daniel was asking. Why conceive of rent and interest as deductions from surplus value? Because, the scenario that, if I put two rabbits in a cage, provided they are each of the right sex, I will get many rabbits at the end of it. But if I put $2 bills in a cage, the same thing is not going to happen, right? So in that sense, there has to be production. So, somebody has to produce. They are going to get fleeced, but they have to produce for somebody to fleece them. Right? That's the key. So we have today in existence structures of power that is allowing a tiny minority to fleece the vast majority. You'd think this should be ripe time for, it's pitchfork time, really. It's socialism time, but it's not happening. That's the key. So anyway, the point is that the reason why people invest is because normally these kinds of opportunities are not available. And that's why you have to invest productively. And this is not an option, by the way, for the vast majority of people. Remember also that the existing financial system it's not an economic system. It's a political system in which some people have more power than others. Some people make more profit than others out of the same events and transactions and so on. For example, somebody mentioned earlier today, pensions. You and I may both have pension plans, but if you look at what happens to pension plans in the today's financial world, number one, they are nothing but throwaway for the top echelons of the financial world to use or to channel in order to exaggerate the price movements out of which they are going to make profits. They're going to make a killing, actually. I shouldn't even call it profits, but anyway, whatever, speculative profits. Number two, when there is a crash, they lose more than the top investors. When there is a boom, they gain less than the top investors. So they are just there as, as I say, essentially to provide the throwaway to exaggerate price movement. So in that sense, the financial system is not a set of economic relationships. It's a set of very political relationships. So anyway, there was one other thing I meant to say, and probably come back to me. Anyway, if I remember later on, I will reply. On the question of the military-industrial complex and war, etc., I'd just like to say that, there is a lot to be understood. It has to do with why the Anglo model won. What were the conditions in which the Anglo model won? And I think it has to do with the United States, as I say, temporary. Remember, many people talk as though the United States was bound to become the overwhelmingly powerful country in the world. This is not true. Yes, already before the First World War, it had become the largest economy in the world. But there was nothing to ensure that it would become larger than all the rest of the world combined, which is what happened at the end of the Second World War. And that would not have happened had it not been for the war, because the war destroyed the rival economies and it boosted the US economy. When President Biden talks about the US being the arsenal of democracy, you guys are putting a halo over essentially the fact that the United States was profiting from selling armaments to Europe all this time, both in the First World War and in the Second World War. Those, if you plot US growth, there are only two huge spikes in the growth, and they are the two wars. And that's that's one thing. Secondly, the United States emerges from this with a chance to do what it has been wanting to do since the early 20th century, which is to replace Britain. It sees British power is waning, so they think that they can replace Britain. The problem with that desire was that the world had already become multipolar. Its own rise, plus Germany's rise, plus that of many other countries, eventually the Soviet Union, etc., the world had already become multipolar. So the United States was condemned to try to be the leader of the imperialist world in a period when imperialists had already set off on its long-term decline. Its peak was 1914. Since then, it has been declining. I wouldn't say it's been declining with anything like the speed I would like to see, but it has been declining. So, and that was the fate of the United States. The third thing that I would say is that in this process, the United States, after 1971, realized, various people like Charles Kindleberger and others were already theorizing this well before 1971 happened, that the way to prop up the dollar while providing liquidity through deficits, which is subject to the Triffin dilemma, is to essentially vastly increase the amount of financial activity. The United States lifted capital controls in the 70s. It then essentially has since then opened a vast casino. And the downward pressure on the dollar is counteracted by inviting the private money of the world to join this casino. This strategy is also now already facing a lot of obstacles. The Europeans entered this casino in a big way in the 2000s, got very badly burned by what was the North Atlantic financial crisis of 2008. It was not a global financial crisis. They got badly burned. They are staying away right now. They're not there, which is why the Federal Reserve has to buy so many treasuries. The treasury market is in big crisis. The United States is now going to issue even more debt. So it's not going to work. So anyway, the point is to come back to this question of war. The United States is waging wars one after another because the United States has no plan B. There is no political leader in the United States which said, look, folks, we tried to dominate the world. We haven't succeeded. Trying further is not going to yield success. We need to learn to make peace with the world and deal cooperatively with the rest of the world. That's the political leadership you need. By the way, Jill Stein is providing that option. Please consider her. Michael and I are working for her anyway. So please consider, she's the only anti-war candidate you've got and the only sensible eco-socialist candidate you've got. So there, she's got plan B.
Great. So thank you to our speakers, our organizers, and everyone who's attended the day. And thank you all.